On behalf of the European Policy Centre, and the Ukrainian National Platform, I want to welcome all of you to this policy dialogue that is going to focus on the initiatives of the Ukrainian government to facilitate the secure reintegration of its eastern regions. It's been several years since Russia illegally annexed and occupied Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine. Achieving a peaceful resolution to the conflict still remains extremely challenging. It seems that the current format is running out of steam. The Normandy 4 format and the OSCE-led trilateral contact group have not yet delivered sustainable results, unfortunately. Indeed, it seems that very little progress has been made in the official negotiations since the summer of 2020. Furthermore, the regional security situation certainly hasn't improved. Some of the steps taken by Russia, most recently the massive deployment of tens of thousands of Russian forces on Ukraine's eastern border and in and around Crimea, along with the huge military exercise that Moscow carried out on the Black Sea, have only served to increase tensions. I would also say that the current situation in Belarus is also contributing to further regional instability, particularly the deepening ties between Lukashenko and Putin, including the strengthening of the Russian military infrastructure in Belarus. This is, in my opinion, extremely detrimental for regional security. And obviously the close proximity to Ukraine means it has, a very detrimental effect on Ukraine as well. The situation, including economic and infrastructure inside the temporarily occupied territories, is also very challenging. Now, Ukraine's leadership continues to prioritize restoring the country's territorial integrity and reintegrating its non-governmental controlled areas. Until today, several important steps have been taken, including confidence-building measures aimed at the residents of the non-government controlled areas have been taken. And we're going to hear more about these measures, not just about the CBMs, but other measures very shortly. Now, today, I'm very delighted that we are joined by Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine and Minister for Reintegration of the Temporary Occupied Territories, Mr. Oleksii Reznikov. Minister Reznikov, welcome to this meeting. I'm also really happy to have with us today Ambassador William Taylor, Vice President of Strategic Stability and Security at the US Institute of Peace. He is also a former US ambassador to Kiev, so he will be very well known to many of you in Ukraine. And he also has a very strong background on the Middle East. I noticed that he used to serve as the US government's representative to the Middle East Quartet. So he is no stranger to crisis scenarios. So welcome to you, Ambassador. Unfortunately, Joanna Hossa, who was due to join us today from ECFR, has fallen ill, so is unable to be here. So I wish you all the best in your recovery, Johanna. And just before we start, a couple of housekeeping rules, which I'm guessing you and the audience are very familiar with by now. First of all, Deputy Prime Minister Reznikov is going to speak in Ukrainian. So you need, for those of you who don't speak Ukrainian, if you need English translation, you need to click on the translation icon at the bottom of the screen. And secondly, for questions from the audience, you can either type them into the Q&A box or you can click on the hand icon. And please feel free to start to pose your questions right from the beginning, which will give me the opportunity to include them in the discussion as we go through. But to start with, I would like to give the floor to Deputy Prime Minister Reznikov to kick us off with his opening speech. The floor is yours, Minister.
Thank you very much. I would like to welcome everybody. Ambassador, a personal hello to you. I'm already used to seeing you on the screen, and we're doing a lot of good for Ukraine. Dear friends, good afternoon. I would like to welcome the audience, and of course I would like to thank the organizers, that is the National Platform Dialogue for Peace and Secure Reintegration and the European Policy Center, for this possibility to share with you my thoughts and that I can share my thoughts with such a distinguished audience, the diplomats of European countries, but not only of European countries, but also the diplomats of other countries who are in Kiev, they know me, and they know that I am not a classical politician. I'm used to speak openly. And also today, I would like to speak openly with you as within a circle of friends. Thus, I shall talk about the topics of the war, the return of our people, and the return of territories. And this is what I would like to talk about with you openly. But to begin with, let us talk about the current state of play. Ukraine will celebrate its 30th anniversary of independence in 2 months from now. For 8 years now, that is for a quarter of our modern history, Ukraine has been defending itself against the Russian military aggression. We are at war, real war. Our people die. And this circumstance has accelerated the process of a maturing of our society. Let me give you an example. If you read any public opinion poll results in Ukraine, you will see that the current president, Zelensky, enjoys an unusually high level of support after 2 years in office, unlike his predecessors. His rating is almost twice as high as in the case of 3 of his predecessors at this point of time. That is despite the fact that he did not have any political experience in the beginning. And maybe the secret is that we can all make mistakes. Not all of our steps are perfect. However, we are genuine and consistent in our actions. We acknowledge and rectify the mistakes we make. People feel this and keep hope alive. And this is how they vote. And everyone is learning to see the essence. And today we are walking the talk that used to be only do things that used to be only talked about for decades. For instance, the land market is opening in Ukraine next month, and this is a promise kept by the new team after 20 years of talks about the land market. Yesterday, I spoke to Leonid Kravchuk, the first president of Ukraine, and we were taking part in the joint meeting with President Zelensky and 3 senators from the United States of America. And right in the beginning of the meeting, Leonid Kravchuk told us that as far as the land market is concerned, that was one of the topics discussed by Kravchuk as he became elected as the president of Ukraine. And there was deferment, there was delays and everything, but there's been no land market in Ukraine. And today, if we are talk about the reduction of the Russian influence, we have to understand that we are consistently taking measures against those who used to be treated as untouchables. This is an example of how active we are. We are shutting down propaganda and media channels. We're returning the assets that had been unlawfully seized and take many other actions. We are implementing the decentralization reform and empower local communities. We delegate power, we delegate resources, and we delegate responsibility. And as a member of the Ukrainian government, I personally fill in more declarations today than any other fellow politician or official in Europe. So I'm being much more transparent than my fellow politicians and officials in Europe. And I'm confident that none of the present at this meeting could say that Ukraine is a non-democratic country, or that we do not hold free elections, or that we do not enjoy the freedom of speech, especially when we are compared against our neighbors, Belarus or Russia. There is a stark contrast. And we understand that many more reforms will need to be carried out, and we are going to do this, as this is in the interest of Ukraine and in the interest of all of our people. It is not only in the interest of our friendly partners who advise us, it is in the interest of our people. And yes, we are becoming more mature. Yes, we're not perfect yet, but even during the war, we're still making real changes. And against this backdrop, society is changing its perception of the events around Ukraine, and the pendulum of social sentiment may swing to the other side. For a very long period of time, especially before the war, we saw Europe as an almost ideal balance of values, idealism, We saw certain romanticism of aspirations, but also see pragmatic actions taken by Europe. We were very much impressed. We felt to be a part of the European space, and just as a reminder, Magdeburg rights and other forms of local government were applied in Ukraine for more than 600 years. So in fact, the Magdeburg law and Magdeburg rights were exercised in Ukraine. This is a great tradition. And now we see that European pragmatism and European values are not always compatible, so to speak. For instance, some people say that they support us, and yet at the same time they're building Nord Stream 2, or they supply turbines to the occupied Crimea. For instance, they refuse to sell us weapons that we can fight with against the aggressor, and their advice is to hold negotiations with the aggressor so as not to vex Russia, although they know it perfectly well that the Kremlin has blocked the negotiations. So I have a question: what kind of Russia don't you want to vex? The one that in full view of the whole world deployed an armada along our borders, which is still there in spite of promises? Is this the Russia that transformed the occupied Crimea into a fortress, or rather an aircraft carrier, over a span of 7 years? Russia has changed entirely the balance of power in the Black Sea. They are changing the balance in the Balkans, in the North Africa, in the Middle East, and all around the Mediterranean. The Russia that fragrantly violated the Budapest Memorandum and cancelled its commitments. May I recall that an open door policy for Ukraine and Georgia was declared during the NATO summit in 2008. Nothing has ever been done to vex Russia for the past 13 years. Nevertheless, Russia, in the meantime, attacked Georgia. Then Russia attacked Ukraine. Let us recall the recent murder cases in Berlin, dozens of cyber attacks, attempts of coup d'etat, explosions in the Czech Republic, to say the least. So just have a look at a map. Right in front of our own very eyes, Russia is absorbing Belarus and squeezes the Baltic states between a dictatorship and Nord Stream 2. Poland has already been hemmed in on two sides. And first Russia downed the Boeing airplane in the east of Ukraine. Now some people thought it was somewhere there far away, and now the Belarusian ruler is intercepting European civil airplanes. It seems that the non-vexing strategy has produced an opposite result. Russia is successfully applying a salami tactics against Europe. They keep on taking small steps forward whenever unopposed. Let me ask you, do you really think Russia is going to stop? Or is someone going to stop Russia? Or why stopping if Russia can always appoint a minister of a European country to the supervisory board of a state-owned enterprise? Let me recall that Ukraine has the population of over 40 million. We have more than 500,000 war veterans hardened in war against the strongest army on the continent. We have a unique experience of struggle in cyberspace and countering information attacks, and we have major advances in developing digital society. And the European Union is keeping us at bay against this backdrop, saying we are not perfect yet. But let me ask you this question: were all the 13 countries that acceded to the EU in 2004 perfect? Were all those countries perfect, especially at the time of granting them a European perspective? So you see, we need this understanding, because that pendulum I have referred to before may be set in motion by such understanding, and the support to European and Euro-Atlantic integration has dwindled in Ukraine over a span of 2 years. It has reduced by 5%, and the support has reduced most significantly in those regions where the support used to be at the highest level, and the youth is also less supportive, and the youth had always been the most pro-European. This is a sign of disappointment in the European vector among the strongest supporters of it. So under such circumstances, more arguments are given to those who are in favor of a Belarusian/Russian model. Is it really in Europe's interest? Of course, this is a rhetorical question, I guess. I would like to thank our European partners and the EU as a whole and individual countries for consistently supporting Ukraine. I mean it. We have indeed received a lot of humanitarian aid, and we're grateful for the regime of sanctions. However, let us think. For how many more years will you be ready to extend humanitarian aid, knowing that the needs are growing? As far as mine sweeping is concerned, we will really need a lot of resources to do mine sweeping. Croatian experience shows us that it's a long-term project, and Croatia has been demining their area for 25 years now. And today, there are environmental risks that are looming over the occupied parts of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. And we already see the aftermath we'll have to face because contaminated water knows no contact line. It's water, just flows in the underground strata. And those are millions of potentially displaced persons. So for how long are the sanctions going to be in place against Russia? But basically, Russia has already adapted to the sanctions. And so, in fact, those sanctions are being treated half-heartedly. So I think that it's kind of looks like using the tactics of too little, too late. Maybe it is high time to address the root causes. And perhaps we need to change our attitude to the aggressor state that is attacking Europe. Perhaps we need to change attitude to Ukraine, which is resisting this aggression. And this is the question to all of us. And the decisions are up to you. And regardless of your decisions, we are going to act in such a way so as to make Ukraine stronger, to increase our resilience to the threats posed by Russia. And we understand that we're talking about long-term perspective. And I would like to outline our strategy in the following way, as we see it. So we are going to be more active internationally, especially in creating new alliances on the regional and bilateral level. So this is our survival strategy, and this refers to strengthening our partnerships with the Baltic states and Poland. We're interested in working together with Moldova and Georgia. We're ready to share our advantages with the countries of the Three Seas Initiative, or Intermario, because we share many common interests and similar challenges. We are interested in special relations with Turkey and with the United Kingdom, in particular in the context of establishing a Crimean platform as a format for the deoccupation of Crimea and Sevastopol. I'm very grateful to all those countries who have already confirmed their readiness to take part in the establishment summit of the Crimean platform that is due to take place in August this year. And I'm also appealing to other countries to join, because we are going to talk there not only about Ukraine, we're going to talk about regional security. Also, in the meantime, we're going to keep on implementing our reforms, but we're going to be more mature and more pragmatic in the advice that we take. So this is what refers, as far as my remit is concerned, that is the reintegration of the temporarily occupied territories. Let me describe you the activities that have been undertaken for the past 6 years. Of course, we're talking about a long-term strategy. So let us call spade a spade. So the experience of Croatia says that demining activities will take of up to 25 to 30 years once the war is over. And probably the eastern Ukraine is the most mined territory in the world. Also, we need to provide for mental reintegration. It will take decades as well. And also another question is renewing the economy, because the loss of Ukraine from the Russian aggression is being estimated to be at the level of $100 billion. So first, we started a broad social dialogue as to the future regulation. We also developed a draft law on the state policy for the interim period that explains to the citizens in Ukraine and in Crimea and in Kiev and in the past the logic of the freeing of those territories, so that this draft law is being reviewed by the government, and we use the United Nations principles in that law, that is the interim justice or transitional justice principles in this draft law.
Зараз цей документ розглядається в тому числі експертами Ради Європи. І маю надію, що він буде розглядатися найближчим часом у Верховній Раді. По-друге, ми розробили...
And I hope has been also considered by the Verkhovna Rada. Secondly, also we're talking about the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast that are under really affected by the war. It's about creating a belt of success along the entire line of contact. And our logic is that the economy of these territories can be saved only at the expense of investors who will fill the budgets of local community. State and donor resources are not enough for this. Right now, we accumulate international technical assistance, loans, government investment for infrastructure developments, but the focus is to create priority development territory with special conditions for investors. And first of all, that includes tax and custom preferences, insurance of military and political risks, extending the jurisdiction of international commercial arbitration, simplified regulations and institutional support. Thirdly, we use a wide range of solutions to maintain communication with citizens in the temporarily occupied territories. Practically, right now, they are hostages of the occupational regime. Naite, we already have the draft law developed on the status of indigenous people. It's very important for the Crimean Tatars, indigenous people of Crimea. The idea of this draft law was discussed for 30 years. At the same time, we are preparing a strategy for development of the Crimean Tatar language for 10 years, because now this language is in critical conditions. We are consistently simplifying the conditions for admission to Ukrainian university for children from the occupied territories. And despite Russia's blockages of crossing points, more and more children are coming for education onto Ukrainian territory. We simplify access to services and public services as much as possible, translate them into online and digital regime to keep in touch, even if the border is blocked. Blocked demarcation line, blocked the connection between Kherson region and Crimea. Also, we are changing the format of broadcast support to Russian-occupied and surrounding areas, because originally on these territories, through media propaganda, was exactly smuggling this hostile ideology. And we don't have any, national differences, any regional or religious difference. This is just propaganda. It's an ideology of the former Soviet Union. And only later on that background, we got soldiers and tanks. That's experience that we can share. For example, to protect Europe from propaganda and misinformation, disinformation could be a pan-European Russian language TV channel. And a base could be created in Ukraine. After all, we have specialist experience, understanding whom are we dealing with, and there is no language barrier. I can list many more, but I will not misuse my time. Just summing up, I suggest our partner to look at Ukraine not as a problem in relation with Russia, but as a part of the solution. Conflicts in Transnistria, Abkhazia, Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Syria, Libya, Salisbury poisoning, it's not about Ukraine. They're about something else and someone else. It's about how Russia sees itself in the world. And Russia is not annoyed by what we do. Just the fact that you exist at all in this civilized democratic world, that's what irritates them. And without a strong, independent, successful Ukraine, which is an integral part of the European family, it will not be possible to contain it. Thank you for your attention. I am ready to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. I think this was a really interesting speech. It was very frank and candid. So thank you for that. And there's a lot of issues that I think you raised that we can definitely come back and touch on, including regarding the EU and the US, etc. But I would just like to start by asking you a couple of additional questions related to this reintegration. You have mentioned in several of your interviews the slogan "secure reintegration." Could you elaborate more what you mean by this secure integration slogan, and what is your vision in this respect?
Thank you very much for this question. Yes, I am convinced about the idea of secure reintegration, because today during 7 years of this war, the children who were born after the start of this war now are school children. So it's very important now that reintegration is based on the backdrop of the national dialogue. The society must understand the value of this reintegration. We understand that some territories suffered, but it has to be communicated. All ideas have to be communicated to the community, because community has to adopt and understand them, because we are a democratic country and the Ukrainian parliament mirrors what our society thinks, what it wants. That's why when we're talking now about amnesty, if it's foreseen by the agreements of Minsk, and we are staunch, we really believe in that, because we need to fight for each life of the Ukrainian, and the final stage, the occupation of this territory, and consecutively a complete reintegration. So it has to be first verified by the society. That's why in the draft law on the reintegration and our law, the transitional justice, this is very important element, because it says that everyone has a right to a fair treatment, to education, to free speech. So all about this was talked about. The General Secretary Kofi Annan talked about in his speech. We're talking about Kofi Annan, the UN General Secretary. So we have to do everything that later on we will have easier time to conduct mental reintegration. With my Slovak colleagues, I talk about it, and based on their evaluation, the mental reintegration is still not finalized, and it was more than 20 years ago.
Thank you very much. I would just like to stay on this issue of transitional justice for a second, because yesterday there was a decree by President Zelensky, which says that all laws related to transitional justice need to be elaborated in a 2-month period. Could you shed some light on how you are going to target this complicated issue in what I think is quite a short period of time?
We are not worried about the time frame, because we are already moving forward, and we're moving very strategically fast. And you know, we announced already that we worked on the text of the draft laws. In January of this year, on the side of our ministry, we have published the first draft, the framework law on transitional justice. And that's exactly what you're talking about. And the Council of the National Defense and Security talked about it with President Zelensky. We have consulted with more than 150 experts, civil society groups, including European experts and groups. We received the recommendations. We have a new draft law now. Officially today, it was sent to ministries and departments to review it. We talk about it with European advisors. So I am sure that during the 2 months time that we have, we will be able to do that. And then we're just going to work to implement it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. I would have a lot more questions, but now I want to hand over the floor to Ambassador Taylor to give him the opportunity to share his views on Ukraine's reintegration strategies, and also perhaps to touch on some of the issues that you raised in your opening comments, particularly related to the points where you give the impression that Ukraine is seen more of a problem when it comes to dealing with Russia rather than the other way around. So I'll give the floor to you, Ambassador Taylor.
Amanda, thank you very much. Minister, it's always good to see you. Great to listen to your views. And I appreciate being able to address this audience. It's a very very important topic and a very well-informed audience. Let me just say that I may have a little internet problem. So if Amanda, if I go in and out, you can take over from me, and I'll be back. I promise to be back. But I think the Deputy Prime Minister gave a very useful, productive, constructive overview at his outset, at the beginning. And let me just, Amanda, take advantage of your invitation to comment on a couple of things that the Deputy Prime Minister said. First of all, we all recognize this 30th anniversary coming up. This is a very important milestone, and we hope to celebrate it here in Washington as well. Ukraine's success is very important to the United States. So we'll want to recognize that and use that opportunity. And the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned a couple of very hard things that Ukraine has done, very difficult reforms that Ukraine has undertaken. Minister, you mentioned land reform, and you mentioned your conversation with the first Ukrainian president. I also remember talking to people while I was there in Ukraine the first time in 2006, 2009, then I was there again more recently, and every prime minister and every president would say, yes, land reform is on our agenda. And then it would always be, but it's going to be next year. It's not going to be this year. We can't yet do it. We're not quite ready, but we'll be ready next year, people said. No, and that went on and on and on. And finally, as you say, this government, or at least this president and a previous government, has passed the laws necessary, and that land reform is taking place. Another very important and underappreciated reform is the one you mentioned on decentralization. I think this is going to be an important part of the reintegration process that we're talking about here today. I think decentralization, putting power in the hands of local governments, making local decisions by locally elected officials is going to be part of the reintegration strategy and success. A couple of your points, of course, on the Russian aggression. I mean, let me just say the same thing that you have said. Ukraine is on the front line of the war that Russia is fighting against, not just Ukraine, that Russia is fighting against Europe, United States, and the West. And you talked about several of the indications of the cyber attacks, the chemical attacks, the salami tactics in Europe. We know that the Russians start on the front line, that is, start in Ukraine on election meddling, for example. And I was an observer in 2014 when the Russians tried to, almost succeeded in affecting the 2014 presidential election. In the end, the Central Election Commission foiled that attempt, but the Russians started there, and then they moved into Europe and meddled in European elections, and then they tried to and had some success in meddling in the United States elections in 2016, and they tried again in 2020 in the United States. All to say that Ukraine is on the front line. It's not just Ukraine, Russia. It is Russia against the West, and Ukraine's on the front line, and which is why we need to support Ukraine in the several different ways that you've discussed. Minister, your point about the Ukraine strategy being both long-term and a survival strategy, I think that's the right way to look at it. The other alliances, the 3 Cs initiatives you mentioned, dealing with the Baltics, Poland, Turkey, UK. President Zelensky has invited, of course, the United States and the British and maybe the Canadians into another format, or at least being part of the discussion in the Normandy format or outside of the Normandy format. You mentioned, of course, the Budapest Memorandum that we remember very well, painfully, that might have merit to reconsider as well. On your points about the reintegration, when I was there a year and a half ago, I visited many of the crossing points and many of the frontline battlefields, trenches on the line of contact, both in the north and in the south. And I saw the conditions that Ukrainian citizens on both sides of the line of contact have to endure in trying to go across to get normal human services, government services on the Ukrainian side of the border, and having to stand in line. I was there in the summer, it was hot. There were older people and mothers with children, small children, and the new administration under President Zelensky and the earlier government was clearly concerned about those people. It was clearly concerned about the welfare and the problems and the difficulties and the discomfort that again, Ukrainians on both sides of the line, both in other side of the line in Crimea, other side of the line in Donbass, had to endure. And it was a genuine interest. And I had sensed the same thing, Deputy Prime Minister, from your remarks as well, a genuine interest in the welfare, in the trying to relieve the suffering of Ukrainians who are on both sides and how to reintegrate them. And I was impressed at the concrete steps that were taken and that are being taken, and you've outlined some of them. Let me, Amanda, just say, as we think about transition, and the Deputy Prime Minister has talked about the transition and the legislation that's being put in place and transitional justice, these kind of things. I think we should think about transition and how it will occur. That is how we get from where we are now, where Crimea and Donbass are occupied, to where we want to end up. And we want to end up with Ukrainian sovereignty reasserted over all of its territory in Donbass and Crimea. So how do we get there? It's not going to happen overnight, and the Deputy Prime Minister's strategy has indicated that this is going to take some time, mentally, physically, militarily, politically, diplomatically. This is going to take some time. But how do we get there? And this may be, and Amanda, I will end on this, and if there's an opportunity to discuss this further, I'd be glad to. This may be where a broadened political mandate for negotiation takes place. And I would like to believe that the United States will take a larger role at the invitation of President Zelensky. Will play a larger role. I'm not in the government right now, and all I can say is they're considering it. And I think it was discussed when Secretary Blinken was just in Kyiv 2 weeks ago. That is a larger role for the United States, and again, maybe with the Brits and the Canadians and the German and French colleagues who have been doing all this work for 7 years with the Russians and Ukrainians, that maybe there is a role, maybe there is a way for the United States to rejuvenate. And Amanda, I think you said at the beginning that the Normandy format is running out of steam. That's a kind way to say it. It does need more steam. It does need more a rejuvenation, and maybe it needs new players, and maybe it needs a new place. Maybe it needs a new location. Maybe a new city. I mean, it's hard to imagine us going back to Minsk. Who wants to fly over Belarusian territory at this point? This is risky. All to say that there may be an opportunity for a new location, a new focus, a new energy, new participants, in order to come up with a new solution to how to get from where we are now to full sovereignty for Ukraine. So, Amanda, let me stop there. Be glad to answer questions or participate in further conversation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Before I move back to the Minister, I would just like to ask you an additional question, staying on the topic of the negotiating format. I mean, why wouldn't President Biden want the United States to be part of a sort of reinvigorated format. I mean, obviously the US is a crucial power. So given the fact that he said, prior to his election and since, that Ukraine is a priority, why would there be any, contemplation as to do that move? I think Ukrainians have been quite disappointed since Biden came into office. I mean, not least because of the decision over Nord Stream, which is actually quite difficult to understand why that decision was taken. So there seems to be an opening now for him to do something to restore confidence in the US from the Ukrainian side. And also, I mean, what's your predictions for the forthcoming summit between Biden and President Putin, and how could that impact Ukraine?
Thank you, Amanda. Two good questions. On your first one, why wouldn't this new US administration engage directly? I can't think of a reason. I think you're exactly right. I think they should. I think they are still putting people in place. I mean, let's be clear. It's still just May. They came into office in January, and they still, they have a Secretary of State. They have a deputy. They just got an undersecretary of state, well known in Ukraine. Toria Nuland knows Ukraine very well. President Biden knows Ukraine very well. We hope to have an ambassador out there soon. With Christina Kvien is doing a super job as charge. It always helps to have a Senate confirmed ambassador out there, and Christina would be the first to agree with that. And I believe that, as I mentioned, this was discussed when Secretary Blinken was in Kyiv with President Zelensky, with Foreign Minister Kuleba, maybe with Deputy Prime Minister Reznikov, but there were conversations along these lines, and so I think they're clearly considering this. And you're right. I mean, in whatever format, whether it's a parallel format, that is US-Russia with Ukraine very much involved, or it's the Normandy format, the Normandy 4 plus the Americans, plus the Brits, plus the Canadians, or a totally different one. Maybe people have suggested a Budapest format. So we're thinking about that right now. And the short answer to your question, Amanda, is I can't think of a reason why we would not engage. And so I am hopeful that we will do that. You mentioned Nord Stream. I will address this as well. I was disappointed as well. This is hard. I sympathize with the Biden administration. They, as I say, they don't have all their people in place yet by any means, and they have competing priorities. The previous administration did not emphasize, indeed ran down alliances. And so the Biden administration wants to reconfirm, re-strengthen, re-energize, recommit to alliances. Germany is an important ally. There's no doubt, no one disagrees with that. I would argue, of course, that you can have disagreements with allies. We have disagreements with allies all the time. We're still allies. It's okay. So again, I don't support the lifting of sanctions or the withdrawal of sanctions on the Nord Stream operators. I think we should continue to do that. And that fight is not over. The U.S. Congress, as you know, is very concerned about Nord Stream 2, and they have not stopped their pressure on the administration. And there have been very effective conversations about Nord Stream 2 with this administration from Ukrainian officials as well. So it's it's not dead yet, or it's not alive yet. Your second question about the summit. A lot of preparation, of course, is going into this summit, as always is the case. One thing I will say at the beginning, just an initial comment, is that we remember where we first heard about this summit, and it was in the phone call that President Biden put in to President Putin while Mr. Putin was massing troops on the Ukrainian border. You referred to that in your opening, Amanda. The Russians had massed, I don't know, 100,000 troops and with a lot of equipment, a lot of serious equipment on the border and in Crimea, and with the threat in Belarus. So that was a big, and no one knew what was up, what was planned, what was President Putin's intent in putting all this force. It's not cheap to move all those soldiers to the border. And so we were all worried. A lot of people were worried about what he might do. President Biden first called President Zelensky, had a good conversation with President Zelensky before President Biden then called President Putin. And President Putin was heard loud and clear three things from President Biden. First message was back off of Ukraine. And again, this was while Putin was massing forces on the Ukrainian border, and President Biden told President Putin, back off. Turns out he did. Turns out President Putin did. I don't know if that was the reason. There were a lot of other international senior people in Europe that made the same kind of calls. But I think President Putin got that message. Second thing Biden said to Putin was, President Putin, I'm going to put sanctions on you in 2 days. This is just a heads up, Vladimir, that there are going to be sanctions coming, new sanctions in 2 days. And sure enough, 2 days later, a new round of sanctions were levied on Russia, just as President Biden warned President Putin 2 days prior. Now, then is where the idea of a summit came up. And President Biden, I haven't seen, wasn't on the call, haven't seen a transcript of the call, but in the context of the first 2 points, that is back off of Ukraine, and we can sanction you if you do bad things, as you have, and if you do bad things, if you invade further into Ukraine, if you kill Navalny, for example, if you do things that will cancel the summit. And so that's where the summit originated, and it was in the context of backing off of Ukraine. And we observe that President Putin seems to have backed off at least some of the troops on Ukraine. We know that some of the troops are still there. We know a lot of the equipment is still there. We know a lot of the naval forces are still there. Nonetheless, he has not invaded. So that's where the summit came from. And President Putin wants that summit. He's eager to have that summit. And so I believe that both the pressure that President Biden put on, as well as I say, other European leaders, including NATO and EU, put pressure on President Putin as well. I think that diplomatic pressure was effective. So that's number one. Number two, what can we expect out of it? I imagine that President Biden will go into this summit in a very different way than his predecessors have gone into previous summits, in particular presidents going into summits with President Putin. So President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, they all, in their different ways, went into their meetings with President Putin, all with President Putin, with the hope or expectation or intent of trying to come to agreements. I think President Biden is different. I think President Biden has learned from all of that previous experience. President Biden has met President Putin. He's told President Putin that President Biden doesn't think President Putin has a soul. That was a pretty direct comment from President Biden. As we know, he famously called him or agreed that President Putin was a killer. All to say that President Biden's eyes are open, or he's clear-eyed about who he's dealing with, and he knows him. He knows the history. He knows the problems. No one has been clearer about the list of transgressions than President Biden in the United States. The Deputy Prime Minister Reznikov just listed a lot of the reasons that to make the case, to make it clear that the Russians are the aggressor in this case. And President Biden knows that. So all to say, I think that it will be a very frank conversation. I don't think President Biden anticipates any agreements other than, say, to set up, I would imagine that there could be one area of agreement, that is the US and the Russians may agree to form some kind of a working group on nuclear issues, on strategic stability and arms control. That's an area where the United States and Russia have similar views, similar concerns, probably different views on how to solve it, but similar concerns about how to reestablish strategic stability. Now, there's a question as to whether or not the Russians want to reestablish strategic stability. But that is one area that I would anticipate, Amanda, in answer to your question, that they might come out with something. But on the other areas, unless President Putin is ready to back down and agree to get out of Donbass and Crimea, and stop all the other transgressions that the Deputy Prime Minister listed earlier, I don't think it's going to be a particularly happy ending to this summit.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Taylor. I'd now want to turn back to the Deputy Prime Minister. You had mentioned earlier a lot of the very important reforms that Ukraine has done. And you also have mentioned the ongoing problem of disinformation and hybrid challenges, and some of the responses, the important responses that Ukraine has done, including shutting down Russian-backed media. Could you perhaps say a few more words about what are going to be the next steps in terms of pushing back against disinformation, including in the occupied territories, where it's also, I would very, it rains down, if I can put it that way, Russian disinformation. I would also be interested to hear from you, what are your expectations from the NATO summit? What can NATO deliver for Ukraine at that summit? And also you mentioned your closer relationship now with Turkey. So I would be interested to hear a bit more about the actual dimensions of the relationship with Turkey. And we also have a question from the floor here, from Dimitro Shurko. Dimitro, I would like you to ask the question live, if you can, because it's nice to hear another voice here. So I'm going to ask my colleague, Natalie, to unmute you. Dimitro,
hello.
Are you there?
You hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that opportunity, Amanda. So that my question is both to Minister Reznikov and to Ambassador Taylor. To Minister Reznikov, from your point of view, what kind of attitude from the West could be satisfaction for Ukraine? Is it appropriate? Is it a dual approach which both NATO and EU have towards Russia? Satisfied Ukraine. I mean, it is deterrence from one hand and the attempt and trying to make some kind of dialogue from another. So that do you really believe that the Putin's attempts to overcome Russia to the sieged fortress is corresponding to the real Ukrainian interests? And if I may, to Ambassador Taylor, just to follow up on the Amanda questions, what is your expectation from the meeting between Mr. Putin and President Biden? Because there are some suspicious that there could be drawn some kind of red lines, including exception of membership of Ukraine both in NATO and in EU. And from my perspective, it would be a disaster both for Ukraine and for the West, the Great West, let me say so. So that my question is to you, do you really believe that the West is interested in that Ukraine overcome to the sieged fortress itself? Thank you so much.
Thank you. I give the floor immediately back to you, Minister Reznikov.
Дякую за запитання.
Thank you for your questions, and undoubtedly Mr. Dmitrov's questions and also Amanda's questions are quite interesting, and I will answer them both. As far as the EU is concerned, we have 27 EU member states, and NATO we have 30 member countries. So most NATO alliance countries are also member states of the European Union. Therefore, their political position and their governments, their leadership has a say, and therefore whatever they say will have a meaning both in NATO and in the EU. Therefore, we need to exercise one standard policy, no dual standard policies. So communication should be quite clear in those countries, because those countries are at the same time NATO allies and also EU member states. And also NATO alliance is not a military alliance, because it is an alliance of countries with common interests with the defense purpose. And this is a very much focused position. Ukraine is not a country that is pleading for charity, like please give us just a little bit of humanitarian aid and we'll be happy. No. We are your partner. We are your neighbor. And today we have a real situation when Ukraine is really facing the Russian aggression that is unfolding in the east of Europe, not in the east of Ukraine, in the east of Europe. And Ukrainians pay with their blood. They shed their blood for the security of the entire continent, of entire Europe. So this is my entry point. As far as the policy is concerned, and for instance, the summit that is due to take place on the 14th of June, and of course, if there are talks, and they're going to talk about the challenges, such as the aggression of the Russian Federation, and if those countries that are NATO member states and EU member states, perhaps they may invite President Zelensky to speak. Let President Zelensky speak for 15 minutes before the NATO summit. If they invite him, this is going to be a very clear sign to this world that Russia is being faced by the civilized alliance of NATO and by the civilized alliance of the EU, and that they are backing Ukraine. It's not about declarations, it's about real steps. And also it's going to be a very serious sign to the 40 million Ukrainians who live today in Ukraine, and they do not clearly see the direction. There is no clarity. So we are not asking, we are expecting some clarity vis-a-vis Ukraine, with regard to Ukraine, because we would like we are becoming mature and we would like to be treated as adults. Now, as far as disinformation is concerned, and as far as propaganda is concerned, in Ukraine, we established a new center to fight disinformation.
This is coordinating body and the national defense body, and it's NDSC, and what they have to gather, they gather all the information from the reconnaissance, intelligence agencies, work on analytics and counteract. So working with similar European bodies, which already have certain experience, would be a great addition to that. You know, today, the information space, it's a space of the hybrid war. It's the same as a real war where we have military technology. But here, the limits, we don't have limits. It's a broader space. So they can influence the thinking, the way of thinking of people around the globe. That's why what we expect from NATO, from the US, completely give us an indication what should we expect. Talking about the Turkey, we are two countries. They are in the Mediterranean region. So talking about the safety on the sea, talking about the technical assistance with development of technologies, sea technologies. It corresponds our interests in Azov Sea and in the Black Sea. As you see, as you have seen, Russia, they closed practically the space there. So not only Turkey, all countries who are there involved in that region cannot move freely. That's why I confirm we have a joint interest. As the Prime Minister of Great Britain, famous Churchill said about the eternity of the interest and not about the eternity of the enemies or problems. So I think that's exactly what we have now. Talking about the fortress that Mr. Dmytro said, it's up to Russia. What do they want? Do they want to be up there in this fortress, or they want to communicate? This is a choice. It depends on the Russian Federation what they want to do. We remember Mr. Brzezinski, when they talk about the future of Russia, he mentioned that Russia's way to Europe is through Ukraine. Ukraine could be the forerunner of these changes, because there in Russia, more than 100 million of people want these changes. 11 million of Belarus want these changes. That's why today we are on forefront. We have done that. We are moving forward in the Euro-Atlantic direction. We want to be a part of the modern world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. I know that we've already gone 3 minutes over time, but I want to give Ambassador Taylor a chance to also respond to the last question before we close the event.
Thank you, Amanda. And thank you, Mr. Shurkov, for good questions, both to the Deputy Prime Minister and to me. Your concern that the United States not negotiate with the Russians, and so you're concerned that President Biden not negotiate with President Putin over Ukraine issues is valid and well understood in the United States. And so I am sure that there will be no deal between Mr. Biden and Mr. Putin on Ukraine that would, for example, in your question, exclude Ukraine from EU or NATO. Ukraine is a sovereign country. Ukraine has all the rights of any sovereign country around the world. There's not big countries with sovereign rights and small countries with less sovereign rights. No, Ukraine has sovereign rights just like every other country in the world, and Ukraine gets to decide, along with its partners in the EU and NATO, whether or not to join those organizations, and that's a sovereign decision to apply, and no one can take that away. Not on the NATO side, certainly not on the Russian side. So I would just reinforce what the Deputy Prime Minister said about Ukrainians defending Europe. Ukraine is on the eastern border of Europe, and it's defending Europe and the West, in the United States as well, from the Russian aggression. So that's why the support is important. I would sure hope that the NATO summit would invite President Zelensky to come talk with those leaders, and in particular with President Biden, before President Biden goes to see President Putin. I think that would be a very important message. Hope that happens.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Taylor. I totally agree with you that the ongoing support for Ukraine from the US and the EU is vital, not just for Ukraine, but also for transatlantic security as well. So I see here for that. So unfortunately, we have to close. I think there's many issues that we could continue to talk about, but we ran out of time. First of all, I would like to thank very much to Deputy Prime Minister Reznikov for joining us today, for sharing his views on many issues, for presenting Ukraine's new reintegration initiatives. We really appreciate the time that you've taken out of your schedule. I think Ukraine has made such important progress over the last few years, and that this progress, I think, sounds like it's going to continue, but clearly the country continues to face many challenges, and this will require the ongoing strong support from its transatlantic allies. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you as well to Ambassador Taylor for sharing your views as well. It was the first time you were here in the EPC, so thank you very much. I hope that we can see both of you again. EPC has always followed Ukraine very closely, and we will be continuing to do so. So from our side and from the Ukrainian National Platform, our partner for this event, many thanks. And I wish both of you and our audience who joined us today, and thanks as well to the interpreters, I nearly forgot, thank you to the interpreters. I wish everybody a fabulous afternoon and evening.